Today we're going to look at question 3 from the 2016 free response exam. It's crossword. So first of all, let's go ahead and get the files. So please go to my course website. I've put a link in the description, and you're going to get 2 files. So you're going to get this CSA 2016 PDF that's got the question in it. And then you're going to go over to question 3 and get the crossword.zip file. So that contains the BlueJ project folder. Okay, so once you have those 2 files, let's go take a look at the question. So here it is, it's question 3, and basically what you need to do is set up a crossword puzzle. So what they do is they give you a 2-dimensional array telling you which of these blocks are black, and then you use that 2-dimensional array to go and set up a crossword puzzle indicating, which blocks are black, which ones are white, and which are labeled. So it sets this up in a very clever way. Now, in order to solve this, we need to do 2 things. So the first thing we need to do is create this method called toBeLabeled, but I just need to jump ahead and talk about part B, because part B involves making the constructor. So in order for this to work, I actually had to integrate the constructor code, and then, the testing will work for part A with this method. So let me go ahead and write part A, and then, once we get to part B, I can go back and erase that code and write it over, the constructor code. Okay, so let me get to the question. So here is my BlueJ project folder. I've got it open, and I've opened crossword.java. So first of all, we're going to do this toBeLabeled method. And it takes in a bunch of parameters. So we take in the row, we get the column, and then also this array called black squares, which contains Boolean values. So let me just show you what that looks like. So I've got it here, and it just says, okay, if there's a black square at that point, it's true. Otherwise, if there's a white square, it's false. So it just contains true, false values. Whenever you see a true, that's where the black square is. Okay, so first of all, we're given this particular array and then a particular row and column. We need to, determine whether or not that should be labeled or not. So turns out with this crossword, there's a particular rule you need to follow. It's the labeling rule. So let me go back and take a look at that. Okay, so you need to follow this rule. So a square is labeled with a positive number if and only if the square is white. And then this other thing saying, okay, if it does not have a white square immediately above it, or it does not have a white square to its left, or both. Okay, so we need to incorporate that. The easiest one, or the easiest logic to incorporate is this. So, we can easily determine if the square is white or the square is black. We just look at that 2-dimensional array, right? This 2-dimensional array would tell us that pretty easily. So I can just say this right away. I can say, all right, well, if black squares are C, so if that's true, obviously it's not labeled. We can't label it, so just return false, right? You can't put a label on a black square. It won't work. Okay, so the next step is maybe to incorporate that second rule. It's the one where if you have a white square immediately above, okay, let me go back to it. So it does not have a white square immediately above it, or does not have a white square immediately to the left, or both. So I could do that. I think the easiest way to do this is just to name this, or just think of this as okay, does it have a white, does it have a black square above it? Does it have a black square to its left, right? If that's the case, then it is labeled. So I think that's an easy way to think about the logic. So I can just do this and say, all right, well, black squares, right? And we want to go run one row above, so I have to do this r-1, and I can sense that that will cause some trouble. Okay, so if we have a black square above or a black square to the left, so our c-1, then so then it will be labeled, right? So return true. Black square above or a black square to the left, then yes, it's labeled. Otherwise, it's not, so we just say else return false. Okay, we're gonna run into some problems here because I can see that, this might cause an index out of bounds error. So let me just see if that's the case. So let me compile, let me run, and then okay, so it's true. So yeah, we did get this array index out of bounds, and that's because what happens when R is 0, right? If R is 0, we are looking at we're trying to get the number of the row above, and obviously that's a -1. So there's nothing there, there's nothing to get. So that's a bit of a problem. So the way to get around this is the following. We need to make a special case whereby if the row happens to be a 0, or the column happens to be a 0, then it's labeled, and we can just return true. So that would be the case. And the black squares have already been accounted for, so we don't have to worry about those. We just have to worry about the ones that are not black and that happen to be labeled 0 for the row and labeled 0 for the column. So that just means putting in another conditional. So I just say this. So if R gets 0 or C gets 0, then it's labeled to return true. Okay, let's see if that works. So I think that might work. Okay, so for the part A, I've got all these test cases here, and I think they do work out. So yeah, row 0, column 8 should be true, true. This should be true, and it is, and false, false. Okay, so that's part A. So for part B, what I actually need to do is go back and erase some code that I've already put in there. So this is actually the solution. And I need to go back and erase this. So just, I have to look, I'll try to do it quickly so people don't get too much of a hint, but I really didn't have a choice. Okay, part B. So part B is this, where I have to write the constructor. So basically, this takes in that two-dimensional array of Booleans called black squares, and we have to go through and set up the puzzle with some squares being black, some having a label, and then some having no label at all. So it'll set it up automatically, which is pretty good if you're a crossword puzzle designer, I guess. Okay, so let's go ahead and do it. It seems to me that we're going to have to create this puzzle array, this two-dimensional puzzle array. I'm going to have to think about doing that. And then there's also the integers, right? The label numbers. So I also have to think about that. Actually, quite a lot going on here. Okay, so first of all, I think set labels. So obviously, if you look carefully at the way that these the crossword puzzle is set up, we don't start at 0. The labels actually start at 1. That's why I set my label equal to 1. Okay, so the next step is I need to create this two-dimensional array called puzzle of type square, and it seems to me that this is going to be exactly the same size as black squares. So all I need to do is determine the number of rows and the number of columns in black squares and just set puzzle equal to that same amount. So I think I'll make a variable rows, and the number of rows is going to be black squares length, and then int calls. So that is going to be black squares 0 length. So that's how we get the number of columns. So now we can go ahead and initialize our puzzle array. So puzzle gets new square, and then the number of rows is rows, and then the number of columns is columns. Okay, so there we go. So that's the setup. Now what we need to do is loop across black squares, and we need to put in the square objects. So we need to generate square objects, and we need to do it in a way that says Okay, so here's a square class. So we need to say, okay, is this particular square black? And if it is, we set this to be true. If it's white, we set this equal to false. So if it's white, we either put a label in there or we do not have a label. So if we put a label in there, we just have the number that I believe I called label. But I think the question said if there's no label, here we go. So if there's no label, we put a 0 in there. Okay, so make sure I'm clear on that. All right, so let me go ahead and do that. So first thing I need to do is loop across black squares. So this should be pretty straightforward. So two-dimensional, looping across a two-dimensional array. So for int rows, row gets 0, row less than black squares dot length, row plus plus. Okay, and then we have the columns. So for int call, get 0, call less than black squares 0 dot length, call plus plus. Okay, so now we need to determine, how exactly that square object is going to be constructed. So I need to go through and need to say, all right, well, first of all, is it a black square? So we can, do that immediately. So we just say, all right, well, if black squares row call, so if that's true, we construct a black square. So, so in that position of our puzzle, so we say, okay, we'll puzzle and then row call. Right, we're going to construct a square object. So you need to say this, new square. And then, is it going to be black or white? Well, if it's black, this is true. So put that in. Now, numbering, since we don't really care about the actual number, I mean, black squares don't have a number associated with it. I can just put a 0. I think that is fine. I think that's according to the specification of the question anyway. Okay, so now we need to figure out if the square is going to be labeled. So let me go ahead and do that. So how do we determine if the square has a label on it or not? Well, it seems to be that we figured it out with this method down here. So I guess that's why they wanted us to do this first. We can use this method to say, all right, is this going to have a label on it or not? And if the case happens to be true, then I can go ahead and assign it that label that I've given up here. So this variable that starts at 1, I can give it to that square object. Okay, so let me go ahead and run that to be labeled. So I say, all right, well, if to be labeled, and I got to give it row call and then black squares. So if this happens to be true, we know that that particular square object needs to have a label on it. So that means puzzle row call get new square. So this time it's not black, so this could be false. But we're going to have to put that label on it. So I've already declared it here. It's 1. Okay, so I'm going to put that label variable. Now, once we're done with that 1, we need to increment it, right? So the next time we set a label to something, it has to be the next number. So this will be incremented, and this will be label plus plus. Okay, so the only other option we can have in this particular puzzle is the sense that sometimes you're going to have blocks that are white but not labeled at all. So that's just the last thing. In fact, okay, that should really be an else if to exclude that case. I don't want to include that other case, so a little mishap there. All right, anyway, so the last bit is going to be just an else. So this last case is where you're making a block, but it doesn't have any label on it. It's just white. So puzzle call. And then we, create a new square. So we do that. So it's white, but the numbering is just a 0. So that indicates there is no numbering. Okay, that's pretty much it for the constructor. There's no return statement here because constructors do not return a value. Okay, so there's the code. So let me go ahead and compile. And let's see if we get a correct result. Run this. We got. Okay, so there's the result, and I think that's right. So let me go ahead and just compare it to the question. So here's my question, and we're supposed to get something like this. So just, kind of comparing it, 22, and we have a white square unlabeled, we have black. So just, looking at the particular numbers and digits and things, just at a glance, I can see it's probably right. Okay, but one more step. I do have a JUnit test bench here, so let me go ahead and run tests. And I see that all 10 tests do work out. So that tells me my code is fine. Okay, so that concludes the question 3 crossword from the 2016 exam. And that code is complete. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.